Welcome back, everybody, to the Mad Genius Thesis. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the life and work of César Vallejo, a really important Peruvian poet of the 20th century.
Right.
To see if his story maybe can give us some insight on this question of, is there a link between genius and madness?
Oh, this is a question for the ages.
Right.
I think there's no better way to kick things off than with kind of a spooky anecdote from Vallejo's life.
Right.
Imagine in 19-20 years before he ever even set foot in Paris, Vallejo had this waking dream where he found himself lying in state, dead, surrounded by all these strangers in a room in Paris.
Wow.
And then years later, he would die in Paris under really similar circumstances.
Okay, now that's just creepy.
Right.
Talk about foreshadowing.
Yeah.
It definitely makes you kind of wonder about the connection between Vallejo's inner life and the art that he was producing.
Absolutely.
So who was César Vallejo?
Yeah.
For those who might not be familiar with his work, he's known for this really innovative and emotionally raw poetry that I think continues to really just captivate and perplex people even today.
I think what makes Vallejo so interesting is that he really does embody this tension between, creative brilliance and personal turmoil.
Right.
Which, goes right to the heart of this mad genius question.
Absolutely.
To untangle this knot, we've got to go into both his biography and his poetry.
Right, because we can't just label him a mad genius and
Exactly. We can't just call it a day there.
Yeah, we need more.
Yeah.
We need to understand the context of his life.
The challenges he faced.
The challenges he faced.
And you know how these experiences might have shaped his whole vision?
His art.
Yeah, his artistic vision.
So let's start with his early life.
Okay.
Vallejo was born in 1892.
Right.
Youngest of 12 children.
Wow.
In a really remote Andean village.
Okay.
And this close-knit religious family really had a profound influence on him. He'd often describe his childhood as kind of a blend of intense love and sort of stifling tradition, which I think you can really feel in his early poems.
I can see that.
I also read that as a child, Vallejo was incredibly sensitive.
Oh, yeah.
Easily moved to tears. But also, he had this really sharp wit and sense of humor.
Yeah.
There's that anecdote about him being challenged to a poetry duel.
I love this story.
To one of his classmates.
Yeah.
As a young boy.
Yeah. I mean, this is classic Vallejo. He basically responded with this verse that, called the kid out for smelling awful.
Oh.
It just perfectly captures that blend of sensitivity and kind of biting humor that's so characteristic of his work.
So we're already seeing these seemingly contradictory traits in him, right? We've got deep empathy, sharp intellect, penchant for, dark humor.
That's right.
Do you think these contrasting elements somehow, feed the creative process, or are they just coincidental?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
But I think in Vallejo's case,
yeah,
it's impossible to separate these parts of his personality from his art.
Right.
It's all very deeply personal, almost confessional.
Yeah.
And those, contrasting qualities are just woven right into the fabric of his poetry.
Let's talk about Vallejo's first collection then.
Okay.
Los Heraldos Negros, published in 1918.
All right.
This is where we start to see some of the darker and more controversial themes emerge.
This is where things get a little bit dicey.
Right.
And this is where some critics believe we start to see glimpses into Vallejo's inner turmoil. Several of the poems in this collection, like Ascuas and Nervosón de Angustia, are believed to contain coded references to a forbidden love affair he had with his niece, Otilia Vallejo Gamboa.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty heavy topic for a first collection.
Yeah.
I imagine that the social stigma surrounding that kind of a relationship...
I mean, especially in the early 20th century...
Yeah, early 20th century.
...would have been immense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we know how this alleged relationship might have impacted Vallejo psychologically?
It's really hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
But we can look at the poems themselves for clues.
Okay.
In Ascuas, for example, there's this sense of burning passion, but also guilt and shame.
Right.
Vallejo writes, and the flesh burns, and the soul, which in you believes, weeps in the corner of the kiss on fire.
Wow.
The imagery is just so visceral.
Yeah.
So raw.
It's like...
It really feels like he's pouring his heart out on the page.
And then to add insult to injury, His poetry was met with mockery by the local press.
Oh, man, can you imagine?
That must have been incredibly isolating.
Yeah.
For this young artist who's already grappling with all these intense emotions.
And it's important to remember the context here.
Yeah.
I mean, Peru in the early 20th century was deeply rooted in tradition.
Right.
And Vallejo's, innovative poetry with its unconventional themes. And language was seen by some as a threat.
So not only was he dealing with these, possibly taboo personal issues,
right,
but he's also facing public ridicule for his art.
Yeah.
That's a lot for anybody to handle.
For anybody.
Let alone, like you said, a
Jefferson.
sensitive soul like Vallejo.
Exactly. And I think, this period in his life is so crucial for understanding where his work goes.
Right.
It's like all this personal and societal pressure was building up inside him, just waiting for a release valve.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that release came in the form of a very public and very traumatic event.
You're talking about the incident in 1920 where he's accused of inciting a riot and arson in his hometown.
Right.
And he's imprisoned for 112 days.
This event just throws a wrench into this whole mad genius equation. I mean, was this a sign of genuine mental instability?
Yep.
Or was he a victim of circumstance? A sensitive soul just caught in the crossfire of social unrest. The evidence is contradictory.
Yeah.
And Vallejo himself never actually spoke directly about his mental state during this time.
It's like we're trying to unravel a mystery.
Yeah.
But the key pieces are missing.
Right.
We have these glimpses into his inner world through his poetry, but we don't have that full picture.
Right. We don't have the full picture of what was going on in his mind.
Right. And I think that is part of what makes him so fascinating.
Absolutely.
He's still an enigma.
He remains an enigma to this day.
To this day, yeah.
We can analyze his work.
Right.
We can trace, the events of his life. But there's always this element of mystery, this darkness that we can't fully penetrate.
It's what keeps us coming back to the poetry and trying to figure out.
It keeps us guessing
what it means.
Right.
Speaking of deciphering, I think it's time that we maybe delve into Vallejo's most groundbreaking and challenging work.
Let's do it.
Trilces.
Okay.
But before we do that, let's take a quick break.
All right, we'll be right back.
We'll be right back.
Okay, so Trilce, published in 1922. It's considered to be his most avant-garde and challenging work.
Yeah, and for those who might not be familiar with that term, avant-garde, it basically refers to experimental art.
Right.
That pushes the boundaries of traditional forms.
Yeah, all the rules go out the window.
And techniques, and Trilce definitely pushes boundaries.
Yeah, he throws the rule book out.
It's almost like he invented this new language to express what was going on inside.
Right.
Trilce comes on the heels of that harrowing imprisonment.
Yeah.
And then his self-imposed exile to Paris in 1923.
So you've got this period of just immense upheaval, poverty, isolation, cultural alienation.
Yeah.
And he produces this incredibly complex and groundbreaking work.
It makes you wonder, did those hardships fuel his creativity?
Right.
Or was Trilce a way for him to work through these experiences through his art?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of both.
Right.
But what's fascinating about Trilce is that it really does reflect this kind of fragmented mental and emotional state.
Okay.
The poems are full of these jarring images, distorted syntax, and even neologisms.
Neologisms?
Which are invented words that Vallejo was a master of creating.
So he's not just playing with words just because.
He's not just being cute.
He's using language to reflect what might have been going on.
He mirrored that internal chaos he might have been experiencing.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, sure. Let's take a look at the poem. 999 calories rum to rapper rush chaz.
Okay.
Even the title itself is a neologism.
Wow.
This jumble of sounds that you just can't easily interpret.
Right.
And in the poem, we find lines like y la muerte con su guadaña de broma, which translates to and death with his scythe jokingly.
That's an interesting juxtaposition.
Right.
Death jokingly.
Yeah, it's almost like he's mocking death, but also acknowledging its presence.
Right.
In this very surreal and kind of unsettling way.
It must have been shocking for readers at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, this poet who's just completely upending traditional notions of poetry.
Trilce was met with a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
Even hostility from critics.
Oh, really?
Some people saw it as just pure gibberish, madness. But there were others who recognized its genius.
Right.
This raw, unflinching exploration of the human psyche.
And it's interesting how this period of just intense creator output coincides with this period of great hardship for Vallejo.
Right.
He's in exile. He's struggling to survive.
Facing all these cultural barriers.
It's like the worse things got externally, the more brilliant his art became.
That's a really interesting observation.
Yeah.
And it's a pattern that we see throughout history with so many artists who struggled with mental illness or, faced really difficult life circumstances.
Right.
And it begs the question, does suffering fuel creativity?
Right. Or is it just that those who suffer so deeply are more attuned to the complexity of the human experience? And then that finds expression in their art.
It's like a chicken or the egg situation.
Right.
We may never know the answer.
But either way, it seems that his exile, his isolation,
mental anguish.
Yeah, all fed into the creation of trills.
I think that's fair to say.
But we can't forget that during this time, he also finds love.
That's right. He meets Georgette Philippart.
Right.
Who becomes his wife.
And lifelong companion.
But
the relationship was very unconventional.
Even by Parisian standards.
I read that Georgette was just fiercely devoted to him.
Yeah.
And she supported him.
Emotionally and financially.
How did that relationship impact his work, if at all?
I think Georgette provided a much-needed anchor for Vallejo during a very turbulent time in his life.
Makes sense.
And we actually start to see a shift in his later poetry. A softening of those harsh edges.
Interesting.
And yearning for connection and tenderness.
So maybe love, or at least companionship, provided some solace amidst all that chaos.
Right. It adds another layer to this whole mad genius narrative.
It's not just all suffering and isolation.
Right.
Maybe human connection plays a role in nurturing creativity as well.
Absolutely. And I think Vallejo's story really highlights how complex this whole issue is.
Yeah.
We can't reduce his genius or his struggle
to just a simple formula.
It's not a simple formula at all.
It's a very multifaceted story.
Multifaceted.
And I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
It really is.
Speaking of facets, let's move on to another important part of Vallejo's life, his growing political consciousness.
Okay.
So in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Vallejo becomes really interested in communism. He even makes several trips to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, he did.
And this new political ideology really had a profound impact.
I mean, it changed his whole worldview and subsequently his writing.
So how did this political awakening manifest in his work?
Yeah.
Does it clash with those earlier themes of isolation and personal struggle? Or does it add another layer of complexity?
It definitely adds another layer.
Oh, okay.
His later poems, especially those collected in Poemas Humanos, they're still deeply personal.
Yeah.
But they're also grappling with these huge themes of social injustice, poverty.
Right.
The struggle for human dignity.
So it's like his focus is expanding outward from the personal to the collective.
Yeah.
But is that inward exploration of the self, that grappling with those potentially mad thoughts and emotions still there in his later work?
Yeah. Is it still there?
Or does it take a back seat
to his political convictions?
That's a great question.
It is.
And it leads us right back to the heart of the matter.
Right back to it.
Is it even possible to separate the personal from the political in his work?
Yeah.
And does that separation get us any closer to understanding the link between his creativity and his potential mental anguish?
I don't know if it does.
It seems like we've come full circle back to where we started.
Full circle.
And I'm not sure we have any easy answer.
That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
You know, Vallejo's life and work, they resist easy categorization.
Sure.
He was a complex person who experienced the full range of human emotion, and all of it just poured into his art.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We've explored his early life, his struggles with forbidden love,
imprisonment,
his groundbreaking work in trills,
his relationship with Georgette.
Right, and his political awakening. But we haven't really landed on like a definitive answer to our mad genius question.
And I don't think we ever were going to Vallejo's story. It's a reminder that the human experience
is messy.
It's messy.
Complicated. And often defies easy explanation.
It defies easy explanation.
But maybe that's precisely where the beauty lies.
I think so.
You know what strikes me?
What's that?
We haven't even talked about that eerie dream he had about dying in Paris.
Oh, yeah.
The one that seemed to foreshadow his death.
It gives me chills every time I think about it.
Yeah, it really does make you wonder if there was something almost like prophetic about his artistic sensibility, some deeper connection to his subconscious or even the spiritual realm.
It's tempting to think so, right?
Right.
And it gets even more intriguing.
Okay.
You see some of Vallejo's closest friends, like Juan Larrea, claim that just before he died, Vallejo actually uttered the words, "I'm going to Spain."
Spain. That's even more interesting.
Right.
Considering his communist leanings and the fact that there was so much turmoil happening in Spain with the Spanish Civil War.
Right. The Spanish Civil War was raging at the time.
Was he drawn back to that struggle?
Yeah. Was he called back,
Feeling compelled to contribute to this fight for a better world.
Yeah, maybe even in his final moments.
Yeah.
It's a pretty romantic notion.
Yeah, it is.
And it feeds into this image of Vallejo as, this passionate idealist,
right,
driven by his convictions.
But as with much of Vallejo's life,
right, there are conflicting accounts.
There's always conflicting accounts.
Always.
His wife, Georgette, insisted that his final words were actually Palais Royal.
Right.
Possibly referring to
a familiar place.
A place that they frequented in Paris.
Right, a place that they frequented.
Wow. So even his death,
I know,
shrouded in mystery.
The mystery and open to multiple interpretations.
It's like his life was a work of art in itself.
Yeah.
Full of symbolism and contradictions and unanswered questions.
It's a fitting end for a poet whose work constantly challenged us to question and interpret.
To dig deeper.
Right, to go beyond the surface.
And that brings us back to the question we started with.
That's right, full circle.
Can we or should we even try to label him a mad genius?
Does that label...
Or does it just oversimplify?
Yeah.
The whole tapestry of his life and his work?
I think it does.
It feels reductive, right?
Yeah.
To try to confine such a complex figure.
It's to fit him into a box.
To a neat little box.
Yeah.
On one hand, we don't want to dismiss the struggles he faced.
Right.
This potential mental anguish that might have fueled his creativity.
Yeah, the darkness.
But we also don't want to reduce his entire being
He's a genius.
To a diagnosis.
Yeah.
To just a label.
I think the key is recognizing that his story is multifaceted.
It's a multifaceted story.
Vallejo was a man who experienced the full spectrum of human emotion.
Absolutely.
He endured hardship,
found love,
grappled with personal demons, and also championed social justice.
Right, all of those experiences.
And all of that.
The joys, the sorrows, the triumphs, the failures.
It's all expressed in his art.
All of it poured into his art.
So instead of trying to answer the mad genius question definitively, maybe we should just focus on appreciating how complex his life was.
And how that complexity...
And how it informed
his unique vision.
I think you're right.
Yeah. Vallejo's story reminds us
that
creativity is not a simple equation.
It's not a formula.
It's a tapestry.
It's messy. Woven from the threads of our experiences, our emotions, our struggles.
Our triumphs.
And sometimes those darkest threads create the most breathtaking patterns.
So well said.
Thank you.
For those listeners who are ready to explore Vallejo's work for themselves.
Yes.
Where should they start?
Well, Los Heraldos Negros is a great introduction to his early work. It's raw. It's visceral. It's brimming with that signature blend of emotional intensity and dark humor.
Yeah, I love that.
And then for a taste of his more avant-garde style, definitely dive into Trilce.
Right.
Be prepared for a challenge.
Yeah.
But it's an incredibly rewarding experience.
And for his later work, where we see his political and social consciousness.
Yes, where it really shines through.
You recommend?
I recommend Masa.
Okay.
It's a masterpiece of compassion and revolutionary spirit.
And remember, this is just a starting point.
Yeah, just the tip of the iceberg.
There's a ton of poetry and prose out there to be discovered.
Waiting to be explored.
So go out there, explore. Let us know what you think.
Yeah, we want to hear from you.
Does his work support the Mad Genius Thesis?
Or is it something much more nuanced?
Hit us up on social media and share your thoughts.
We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Mad Genius Thesis.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring.
And remember,
there's always more to discover in this vast landscape of human creativity.